Assalamualaikum Warahmatullahi Wabarakatuh. We're from group 3. We're going to explain about historical research. So our group is contained by me, Aprilia Zahrotunnada, and my friend Reny, Valerina, Fantasya, and Sri Indrasanti Ghanie. And for the first thing I'm going to explain is about introduction of the historical research. So historical research has been defined as the systematic and objective location, evaluation and synthesis of evidence in order to establish facts and draw conclusion about past events. The act of historical research involves the identification and limitation of a problem or an area of study. Sometimes the formulation of a hypothesis or set of questions, the collection, organization, verification, validation, analysis, and the selection of data, testing the hypothesis or answering the questions where appropriate, and writing a research report. This sequence leads to a new understanding of the past and its relevance of the present and the future. And the values of the historical research is, the first is, it enables solution to contemporary problems to be sought in the past. The second is it throws light on present and future trends. The third is it stresses the relative importance and the effects of the various interactions that are to be found within all cultures. The fourth is it allows for the revaluation of data in relation to selected hypotheses. Theories and generalizations that are presently held about the past. And for the historical research, the ability of history to employ the past to predict the future and to use the present to explain the past, give it a dual and unique quality, which makes it especially useful for all sorts of scholarly study and research. The historical study of an educational idea or institution can do much to help us understand how our present educational system has come about. And this kind of understanding can in turn help to establish a sound basis for further progress or change. And historical research in education can also show how and why educational theories and practices developed. It enables educationalists to use former practices to evaluate newer emerging ones. And for the choice of subject, the choice of a problem can be sometimes be a daunting business for the potential researchers. Once a topic has been selected, however, and its potential and significance for historical research evaluated, the next stage is to define it more precisely, or perhaps more pertinently. Delimit it so that a more potent analysis will result. Too broad or too vague a statement can result in the final report lacking direction or impact. The hypothesis gives directions and focus the data collection and analysis. It imposes a selection, a structure on what would otherwise be an overwhelming mass of information. And for data collection, one of the principal differences between historical research and other forms of research is that the historical research must deal with the data that already exists, because historical research is using data that already been researched by older researchers, so we have to deal with data that already exists. And for the data collection, the primary research sources of data has been described as those items that are original to the problem under study and may be thought of as being two categories. Thus, first is the remains or relics of a given period. Although such remains and artifacts as skeletons, fossils, weapons, tools, utensils, buildings, pictures, furniture, coins, and objects that were not meant to transmit information, to subsequent areas. Nevertheless, they may be useful sources providing sound of evidence about the past. And the second is that those items that have had a direct physical relationship with the event being reconstructed. This category will include not only the written and oral testimony provided by actual participants in or witnesses of an event, but also the participants themselves. Documents considered as primary sources include manuscript, charters, law, archive of official minutes or records, files, letters, memoranda, memoirs, biography, official publication, wills, newspaper, and magazines, and etc. All these are intentionally or unintentionally capable of transmitting a first-hand account of an event and are therefore considered as sources of primary data. And for the evaluation, because workers in the field of historical research gather much of their data and information about records and documents, this must be carefully evaluated so as to attest their worth for the purposes of the particular study. Evaluation of historical data and information is often referred to as historical criticism, and reliable data yielded by the process are known as historical evidence. Historical evidence has thus been described as that body of the validated facts and information which can be accepted as trustworthy as a valid basis for the testing and interpretation of hypotheses. Historical criticism usually undertaken in two stages. The first is the authenticity of the source is appraised, and second, the accuracy or worth of the data is evaluated. The two processes are known as external and internal criticism, respectively, and since they each present problem of evaluation, they merit further inspections. And the next material is gonna be explained by my friend Sri Indrasanti.
Okay, I want to explain about external criticism. External criticism called as lower criticism. So, external criticism refers to the authenticity of the document. Once a document has been determined to be canon, from an appearances on appearance and more particularly to question of authorship and textual circumstance such as time, place, and purpose. So, move to internal criticism. Internal criticism, sometimes called a higher criticism, having established the authenticity of the document. The researcher next task is to evaluate the accuracy and worth of the data contained therein. Value and worth of its contents, it is literal meaning and reliability of the statement themselves. Next. Plummer, 1983, remained as resident in examining possible sources of bias which prevent researchers from finding out what is wanted and using techniques to minimize the possible source of bias. Researchers generally recognize three sources of bias. The first is those arising from the subject being interviewed. The second is those arising from themselves are researchers. And the last is those arising from the subject-researcher interaction. Next. Now move to the writing the research report. The writing of the final report is equally demanding and calls for creativity and high standards of objective and systematic analysis. Best, 1970 has listed the kinds of problems occurring in the various types of historical research projects submitted by students. These include the first is defining the problem too broadly. Next is the tendency to use easy to find secondary sources of data rather than sufficient primary source, which are harder to locate but usually more trustworthy. The next is indicate historical criticism of data due to failure to establish authenticity of source and trustworthiness of data. So the next is for logical analysis. For logical analysis resulting from oversimplification, overgeneralization, failure to interpret words and expression in the light of their exact meaning in an earlier period. So failure to distinguish between significant facts in a situation and those that are irrelevant or unimportant. So the next is expression of personal bias. And the last is poor reporting in style. Next, Both and Gel, 1979, 40. 4000 suggests several mistakes then can be made in conducting historical research. The first is the selection of a topic for which historical sources are slight, inaccessible, or non-existent. Overlays on overlays on secondary source, so failure to subject the historical source to internal or external validity or criticism check. Lack of reflexi- reflexive, reflexivity and the researcher's selectivity and bias in using source. Importing concepts from other disciplines, making illegitimate inference of causality and monocausality, generalizing beyond acceptable limits of data, and the last is listing facts without appropriate thematization. So, Sutherland 1969 has brilliantly illustrated two further common error among historians of education. The first is projecting current methods backward onto a historical background, which leads to distortion. The second is description in a vacuum, which fails to illustrate the relationship of the educational system to the structure of society. Next, Moudly, 1978, itemizes five basic criteria of evaluating historical research. The first is problem, the second is data, the third is analysis, the fourth is interpretation, and the last is presentation. Next, the use of quantitative method. Tribe 1969, the comparatively recent past. However, attempts have been made to apply the quantitative methods of the sciences to the solution of historical research. So, Bailey, 1978, the one having greatest relevance to historical research is that of content analysis, the basic goal of which is to take a verbal, non-quantitative document and transform into quantitative data. So, the purpose of content analysis have been identified by Holtz C. 1968. The first is to describe change in communication content. The second is to relate known characteristic of source to message they produce. So the next is to audit communication content against standard, to analyze techniques of persuasion, and to analyze style, to relate known attributes of the audience to message produced for them, and the last is to describe pattern of communication. Life stories. The life history, according to Plummer, 1983, is frequently a full-length book about one person's life in his or her own words. The life history is an interactive and cooperative technique directly involving the research. Miller, 1999, demonstrates that biographical research is a distinctive way of conceptualizing social activity. And three main approach to analysis is the realist, the neo-positivist, and the last is the narrative. Denzing 1999 suggests that there are several varieties of biographical research methods, including biography, autobiography, story, discourse, narrative writing, personal history, oral history, case history, life history, personal experience, and case study. Conley and Clandin, 1999, who indicate several approaches to narrative inquiry. The first is oral history, the second is stories, the third is annals and chronicles, the fourth is photograph, the fifth is memory boxes, the sixth is interview, the seventh is journal, the eighth is autobiography, the ninth is letter, the 10th is conversation, and the last is document.
So, in this occasion, I will explain about the preparation and the data of the historical research, such as the data collection, data storage, data analysis, and the data presentation. So, we are going to talk about the preparation. In preparation, involves the researcher both in selecting an appropriate problem and devising relevant research questions. Questions to be asked at this stage are: the first question is, who is to be the object of the study? The object of the study is the created person, the common person, the volunteer, or the selected person. The second question is, what makes a good informant? A good informant is able and willing to establish and maintain a close, intimate relationship with the researcher. The third question is, what needs clarifying in the early stages of the research? The motivation of the researcher needs to be made explicit to the intended subject. In this slide, we are talking about the data collection. The data collection is central to the success of life stories, the researcher's ability to use a variety of interview techniques. For example, it can be face-to-face, telephone, via email, or fax. So, in the data collection, there are 4 types of interview that can be seen in chapter 15. The first interview is informal conversational interview that has the characteristic question emerge from the immediate context and are asked in the natural course of things. There is no predetermination of question topics or wording. The second type of interview is the interview guide approach that has characteristic itself is the topic and the issues to be covered are specified in advance. In online form, interviewer decides sequence and working of question in the course of the interview. The third type of the interview is the standardized open-ended interviews. The standardized open-ended interviews is the exact wording and the sequence of questions are determined in advance. All interviewees are asked the same basic questions in the same order. The last type of interviews is the closed quantitative interviews that has the characteristic itself. It is the question and response categories are determined in advance. The responses are fixed. The respondent chooses from among these fixed responses. So there are the 4 types of interviews that can be known as the data collection. In the next data is the data storage. The researchers must make early decisions about the use of tape recordings, the how, what, and when of their transcription and editing, and also development of coding and filling devices if they are to avoid being totally swamped by the materials created. The third data is the data analysis. The data analysis typically is a reliability in life history research, hinges upon the identification of sources of bias and the application of techniques to reduce them. Bias arises from the informant, the researcher, and the interactional encounter itself. It is according to the Plummer in 1983. The several validity checks are available to intending researchers. Going to the next slide, if you can see to the box 5.1. According to the Plummer, in this slide, as you all can see, this is the box 5.1 that include the principal sources of bias in life history research. According to the Plummer, in 1983, the principal sources of bias in life history research include the source as the informant, the researcher, and the interaction. The informant, the researcher, and the interaction has different question for all. According to that box, is that the Plummer identifies the followings. These are is the first, the subject of the life history may present an autocritic of it, having read the entire part. The second is a comparison may be made with similar written sources by way or identifying points of major divergence of similarity. The third is a comparison may be made with official records by way of imposing accuracy checks on the life history. And the last is a comparison may be made by interviewing other informants. The last data in historical research is the data presentation. According to the Plummer, there are 3 points of direction for the researcher intent upon writing a life history. As the following is according to the Plummer said there are 3 points of direction for the researcher intent upon writing a life history. The first is the researcher have a clear view of who you are writing for and what you wish to accomplish by writing the account. Are you aiming to produce a case history or a case study? The case histories tell a good story for its own sake, according to the Plummer in 1983. And also the case studies, by contrast, use personal documents for whether theoretical purposes such as the verification and or the generation of the theory. The second is having established the purpose of the life history, decide how far you should intrude upon your assembled data. The intrusion occurs both through editing and interpreting. The editing, such as the cutting, sequencing, disguising names, place, etc., is almost a sine qua non of any life history study. So the last is as far as the mechanics of writing a life history are concerned, practice writing regularly. So that's all for us. If you have any questions, please ask through the comment below with the format write your name, NPM, then the question you will ask. Thank you for watching to our video until the end. That's all from our presentation of Group 5. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.